everyone, and welcome to my highlights and thoughts video for Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin. So, it's been a couple of days since I finished my first playthrough of the game, and since then I have been trying very hard to get all of my thoughts about the game into some semblance of order. Which, however, has been proving to be a bit of a difficult task due to the simple fact that there are so many of them. So I am apologizing in advance if at some point in this video my thoughts end up veering off into a completely different topic and this kind of ends up being more chaotic than my highlights and thoughts video for Dark Souls Remastered was. I mean, obviously I am going to try to avoid that, but you know, heads up guys, heads up. So yeah, with that said, let's dive straight into it, starting with the game mechanics of Dark Souls 2. So, regarding the game mechanics, there are a couple of things which I would like to mention. More than a couple, actually. Like about a dozen or so, if we're completely honest. But I'm afraid that there's a very real possibility if I did that, I might just end up talking ad nauseam about them, and that might actually bore you guys. So I am going to try my best to be as succinct as possible here. So let's start with my one single point of discontent in regard to the game mechanics, and that is the introduction of the adaptability stat. So adaptability is something that was not present in Dark Souls 1, and when I saw it for the first time when I was going through character creation, obviously I didn't know what it actually did. So I chose the option to get a bit of an explanation about that stat, and the explanation that I was given was that adaptability is the stat that determines a player's ability to dodge or evade attacks. Which does actually sound pretty straightforward, and the way that I interpreted it was that, okay, I've got standard dodging ability right now, and through adaptability I can improve it to, say, ninja level dodging or something like that. Interesting, but not necessarily what I would call an important stat. So what I ended up doing at the beginning of my playthrough is to just completely ignore adaptability and instead primarily focus on raising my other stats like health and endurance and strength and dexterity. Essentially the same stats which I'd mostly focused on in Dark Souls 1. And I kept doing that up until, I think it was maybe episode 4 or 5, somewhere thereabouts, when someone in comments very kindly decided to give me a more detailed explanation as to what adaptability actually did. And the explanation was that adaptability determines the number of iframes a player has and allows them to raise their iframes to the standard number and go beyond it if they want to. So in short, that's the moment when I found out that I hadn't started the game with the standard number of iframes I'd gotten used to in Dark Souls 1. And that's also the moment when a light bulb kind of just lit up in my mind, because at that point I had started to feel slightly frustrated because there had been a few instances where I very visibly managed to dodge an attack and yet the attack would still connect and I would take damage. And I just couldn't figure out why that was the case. So I'd pretty much come to the conclusion that, well, like probably most players would, that the hitboxes of Dark Souls 2 really were, in fact, as bad as people were saying in the community. And then, thanks to the comment, I found out that it wasn't actually the hitboxes that were the problem, it was my iframes which were the issue. Needless to say, I decided to correct that as quickly as possible, and since I was still relatively at the beginning of the game, it didn't take me that long to get the necessary number of levels to get my adaptability up to, I think it was at level 21 that agility says 98. So essentially I found out that if the agility is at 98, that's the standard number of iframes. And that's what I aimed for. And once I did get my agility up to 98, the rest of my gameplay was like, the rest of my playthrough was essentially very normal. No different than what it would have been for Dark Souls 1. Now, that's all fine and good, but it turned out, the explanation continued, that adaptability wasn't just a stat that determined a player's number of iframes, it also determined the speed at which healing items are consumed. Which was the second moment when the light bulb lit up. Because I had noticed, I couldn't prove it, but I had noticed that in Dark Souls 1 I was able to take an Estus flask much faster than I was able to in Dark Souls 2. And again, I had been wondering why that was. Couldn't figure out why. Explanation told me why. Because of adaptability. Now, if the developers were going for a sense of realism, including like making the consumption, the speed of the consumption of healing items dependent on adaptability, on agility, does kind of make sense, because different people do have different reaction speeds. So one person would execute a certain motion maybe more slowly than someone else would. And, you know, people have varying reflex speeds, so it kind of makes sense viewed from that kind of perspective, but this is a game. This is a game, and I can't really understand why the developers would make adaptability a separate stat. I don't mind experimenting. In fact, I very much appreciate it, because they didn't want to just copy Dark Souls 1. They didn't want to just do essentially a remake of Dark Souls 1 with, I don't know, a different aesthetic or something like that. They did want to do something different, to make something different, and they very much succeeded with that. Because ultimately, my playthrough of Dark Souls 2 felt like something completely separate and different from what my playthrough of Dark Souls 1 was. And that made my experience with Dark Souls 2 stand out more in a very positive way. So honestly, experimenting with something different is something I greatly appreciate, but adaptability was not it, guys. Adaptability was not it. But thankfully I did receive that comment, I did receive that explanation, and I was able to get my agility up to 98, and once I had done that, the rest of my playthrough was very much a normal one, and I was able to enjoy it, instead of getting frustrated because I would think that the hitboxes were skewed or something like that. So yeah, that's my one point of discontent in terms of game mechanics. Everything else is just positive. Starting with the healing items, since I mentioned them just now, let's start with the healing items. So in Dark Souls 2, unlike how it is in Dark Souls 1, the player starts with only one single Estus flask, and in order to raise that number, the player has to find Estus flask shards. And honestly, I thought it was brilliant, because in order to find those shards, the player would have to take the time to properly explore the various areas. And by exploring those areas, aside from maybe finding an Estus flask shard, the player could also find unique items or hidden passages, illusory walls. And I feel it's actually quite a brilliant move to add this extra incentive to get the players to explore, instead of just, rush through an area zigzagging past enemies in search of the next boss fight or something. So I actually really liked that. But more importantly, this had a second effect for me personally. Namely, Estus flasks are definitely the healing item both in Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 1, which heals the best out of all of the healing items. it heals the fastest and it usually heals the most. So obviously Estus flasks are the best possible item to choose for boss fights, healing item to choose for boss fights. Now, in Dark Souls 2, the player ventures into the first area, having only one, or maybe if they're lucky, 2 Estus flasks available, which means that they have to use other healing items, which are more readily available, and that, in this case, means the life gems. I loved having a greater variety of healing items in Dark Souls 2. So not just the life gems, radiant life gems, and old radiant life gems, but there were also items like crimson water and rouge water, and in the DLC they introduced dried roots, and I think bright bugs also healed. I'm not entirely certain, but there was definitely quite a variety of healing items available to the player. And life gems, the standard life gems, could be both found in areas and bought in a pretty much infinite number from Melentia, who is more or less the first NPC merchant outside of Majula that the player encounters. So the life gems are definitely the item most readily available to the player. And this, for me, changed my approach to exploring areas, firstly, because life gems, although they are a good healing item, heal more slowly than Estus flasks. And so what I ended up actually starting to do, instead of just walking into an area and dealing with enemies as they come, is to actually take a few moments to observe an area, see where there are some enemies, and to figure out, okay, what would be the best way to approach those enemies, what would be a good area to run away from those enemies so that I can heal if I need it. And it just made me approach new areas differently. And I feel that this really paid off, particularly in some later areas, such as the Shrine of Amana area, where, I just went in there a little bit, scouted out the area, located all of the enemies, and took as many of them out as possible from a distance. And that pretty much led to the Shrine of Amana area being essentially a pleasant walk in the park for me. I genuinely just enjoyed that area, and I even managed to get through it in one episode. And then I found out in comments that the Shrine of Amana area is one of the most hated areas in the main game. So the fact that my main healing item, my best healing item, was so limited made me change my approach to exploration. And it also made me change my approach to boss fights. Because obviously, again, Estus flasks are the most effective healing item for boss fights. But since there was such a limited number of Estus flasks at my disposal at the very beginning of the game, I started to try my best to get hit as little as possible by the bosses. And in order for that to happen, I started actually observing the bosses more closely, seeing, okay, what is a tell that could inform me what kind of attack is coming, what kind of attack chains are there, when would be a good moment to heal, when would be a good moment to gain some distance, when would be a good moment to attack, and if I do attack, how much can I attack? So I just gradually started noticing these little things little by little, and I feel that it helped me really improve as a gamer, to the point where some of the most difficult, or rumored to be difficult, boss fights in the game, such as the Fume Knight boss fight, ended up actually being a lot of fun for me. I really enjoyed fighting the Fume Knight because it was just fun. It was just fun figuring out the flow of the fight and essentially learning the dance steps and then being able to match them and to join in. It was just so much fun. It was just as much fun for me as it was for me to fight Artorias in the Dark Souls Remastered DLC. Just an absolute blast. And I don't think that would have been the case if I hadn't been forced at the very beginning of my playthrough of Dark Souls 2 to change my approach to the bosses and to actually improve my gaming. So this change to the main healing mechanic of Dark Souls was one that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. Another mechanic that I enjoyed was the fact that in Dark Souls 2, it's not possible to level up at bonfires. The player has to go back to Majula in order to level up with the Emerald Herald. As opposed to how it was in Dark Souls 1, where the player could level up at any bonfire. Now, what that meant in Dark Souls 2 is that I had to regularly return to Majula, and since over the course of my gameplay I would meet various NPC characters, and actually the majority of them would end up returning to Majula and pretty much just settling down there. And when they did that, it kind of led to a sort of community being created in Majula, and with that community growing, Majula kind of just came alive. And together with that, there was just this sense of hope and warmth and welcome that also settled over the initially pretty kind of desolate feeling place. And what that meant for me is that the more I returned to Majula, the more people there were, the more people I helped, and the more the sense of hope and comfort and warmth grew, the more I just started seeing Majula as home. It was not just a place to go to level up. It became a place of rest, of comfort, of safety, of a place where I could just take in some positive energy after maybe something particularly difficult, like say a very tedious boss fight against certain kitties, for example. And I loved that. I loved having this sense of home with Majula, with the main hub of Dark Souls 2, which wasn't the case with Dark Souls 1. I mean, Firelink Shrine was nice, it was pleasant, but there wasn't really any reason there for me to form an attachment to it. Whereas here, with Majula, there were many reasons actually, and that just made the place nice and made, I don't know, I want to say it made the game, like my playthrough, feel kind of more wholesome in a sense, but that's not quite the right word. It was just nice. Let's settle for that. It was just nice. And I very much enjoyed that. The game mechanic that I probably enjoyed the most, and this is probably something that I'd imagine not many people say, is the hollowing mechanic. So in Dark Souls 1, if a player was human and they died, they would lose their human appearance and would appear hollow. But that was about it. Like, that was the only consequence to dying in Dark Souls 1. Essentially just this change in appearance, and that was it. Nothing else. Whereas in Dark Souls 2, if a player is human and they die, they also lose their human appearance. Yes, they do look hollow, but in Dark Souls 2, every subsequent death leads to a progression of the undead curse, and this progression becomes visible, physically visible, in the form of, for example, there being less and less hair, in the way that there is less and less muscle mass, up to the point where I think maybe when the health bar is about at 2/3 or so available, the player character essentially just looks like skin and bones, like the classic image of an undead just risen from the grave, essentially. And I really liked that in Dark Souls 2, we could actually see the physical impact of the undead curse on an individual, and, you know, as it progressively becomes worse and worse. And this also actually impacted the physical abilities of the player character as well. So it took me quite a while to actually notice this, unfortunately, but I did notice it. So for example, it would take longer to execute a dodge roll, and it would also take longer to execute an attack. And I noticed this at the very beginning, but then kind of forgot about it, even before character creation. When the health bar is at like halfway down, the standard run, not the dash, just the standard run looks actually more like a shuffle, because there are no muscles to enable a fast run or a standard run. I actually really loved this attention to detail that the developers added when it comes to the progression of the undead curse. And they didn't just do this with the physical impact of the undead curse, they also did it with the mental impact of the undead curse. So it was actually possible in Dark Souls 2 to see the way that the undead curse would affect the mind of the one afflicted with it. Unlike how in Dark Souls 1, in one moment the NPC, the character, would be perfectly fine, in absolute control of their wits and memory and self and everything, minus the failing will to live, minus that. And then in the next moment they would be hollowed and, attacking the player character. This was the case with Oscar in the Undead Asylum. It was the case with the Crestfallen Knight in Firelink Shrine. And there was really no in-between between the two states. There was no in-between. It was completely fine and then completely hollowed, and that was it. And here in Dark Souls 2, there was an actual progression in regard to the mental state of an individual afflicted with the undead curse. This was visible in Macduff, it was visible in Cloan, it was visible above all others in Lugatil. And I really again appreciated the fact that the developers gave or offered the opportunity for this insight into the way that the undead curse actually worked, which Dark Souls 1 hadn't. And speaking of Lugatil and the mental impact of the undead curse, Lugatil's quest line is definitely one that hit quite hard. Because the way that the undead curse progresses for her, it makes her start to question her sense of self and to essentially realize what lies at the core of her being, essentially. And this is the fact that at the core of every human lies the desire to live. Just that, the desire to live. And this is something that I feel is very much highlighted, I suppose would be a good enough word, highlighted in Dark Souls 2. It's a philosophical aspect that is highlighted in Dark Souls 2, which I hadn't expected at all. I didn't think that there would be this kind of depth in a game. And so when I experienced it, I was completely taken aback by it, but at the same time, as Lugatil's questline progressed, as the undead curse did its foul work upon her, in her words, it prompted me to reflect on what it means to live, and what it means to be alive, and what it actually means to be human. And that was really interesting. I did not expect it, and it was really interesting and very thought-provoking. And it's something that is it's not a single moment, so to say, where this becomes a topic in Dark Souls 2. It's something that is repeated throughout it, be it in a very subtle way, like for example the way that the developers added the book cover of Le Désir de Vivre, the Desire to Live. I forgot who the author of that particular book was, but it is a real French book. I recommend reading it. It's quite fascinating. And it deals with exactly these questions that I mentioned. So it's not just in Lucatiel's questline that it's seen, it's in the objects that they leave or that they included in the game. It's in Aldia's conversation, Aldia's dialogue, I should say. Both the lore that is... so wait, I have to start this one again. So Aldia is another character in Dark Souls 2 who I actually quite like and find very fascinating, because the Aldia that is real... No, that is the Aldia that the player gets to know by collecting various items and even soul descriptions is different to the Aldia that the player actually interacts with. Because the Aldia that is described in the items was the human Aldia, and the Aldia that the player interacts with is an immortal being, essentially, who has somehow become into, I don't know, he has turned into some kind of tree creature. I can't find the words to describe Aldia's appearance. I can't find the words to describe his appearance, but more important than his appearance is what he says to the player. And what he says to the player is obviously related to the lore of the game, yes. He essentially, little by little, lifts the curtain and reveals the truth of the undead curse, the first sin mentioned in the game's title. But at the same time, his dialogue can also be applied to real life in a sense, and that also prompted a lot of reflection. Again, regarding the question of what does it mean to be human, what does it mean to live, what is at the core of every human being, the most important, the most primal of desires, the desire to live. And I really liked this, having this additional philosophical facet to the game. But obviously, like, talking about lore, it wasn't just the lore of the undead curse, which was really interesting. It was also the lore of Drangleic, obviously, the kingdom throughout which the player character can wander. But it was also the lore of the places outside of Drangleic, which was really fascinating to collect. Because, yes, in Dark Souls 1, other areas outside of Lordran were mentioned. So there was a store, there was Karim, there was Katarina. These places were mentioned. They were only pretty much just mentioned. Like, I think maybe for one or two of those places there was a little bit more extra information available in an item description or two, but that was about it. Whereas here in Dark Souls 2, the item descriptions do actually reveal some information about the culture and societies of these other places. So, for example, in Ferosa, the war god Faram is worshipped. Or, for example, because of how Jugo is geographically, or geographically, the desert sorceresses have certain, a certain culture and abilities and history. Or, for example, Mira, being a land in constant conflict with its neighbors, has led to the creation of a very specific type of society there. So finding out all of these little details made the world of Dark Souls 2 feel more complete than the world of Dark Souls 1 did. And so, of course, the lore hunter in me absolutely enjoyed the heck out of collecting all of the outfits and items and weapons and spells and everything. Absolutely adored that. Absolutely adored that. And I also have to mention, since I am talking about the lore, that it wasn't just the lore of the main game which was interesting and intriguing, it was also the lore of the DLCs. Some of the best lore in the game, actually, in my opinion. Because finding out why Shulva is the way it is right now, or why Eleam Lois is the way it is right now, was absolutely fascinating. particularly the role played by the various children of Dark, or Sisters of Dark as I decided to call them. And through the Sisters of Dark, the DLCs are connected and elaborate upon some of the lore of the main game. And I absolutely loved that, because the more I played, particularly once I actually started playing the DLCs, the more I was able to actually get a more complete picture of what was going on in Drangleic, what had happened in Drangleic to lead to its current state, and what the current danger might possibly be. So yeah, just the lore of Dark Souls 2 is absolutely amazing, and very much one of the main reasons why I enjoyed my playthrough as much as I did. Very much so. And of course, any story has to have a good beginning and a good ending, and the ending of Dark Souls 2 was just amazing. So in Dark Souls 1, at the end of the game, the player has the choice between linking the flame and renewing the Age of Fire, or leaving the kiln of the first flame and ushering in an Age of Dark. These were the two choices essentially in Dark Souls 1. And initially, and for actually the vast majority of this playthrough, I thought that it would be the same for Dark Souls 2. You know, same choice at the end, either link the flame or leave it and usher in an Age of Dark. I didn't realize this until actually after I'd finished the final episode of my playthrough, and after I'd made my choice, that in fact that was not the choice presented in Dark Souls 2. So sitting the throne is the equivalent of linking the flame and continuing the Age of Fire, continuing the cycle, renewing it. So that is still the same, but the other option is not ushering an Age of Dark. Because breaking the cycle in Dark Souls 2 did not in fact actually equal ushering in an Age of Dark. What Aldia asks is, what is it that the bearer of the curse seeks? Light, dark, or something else entirely? Not light, not linking the flame, not dark, not ushering an Age of Dark, but a third path, an unknown path, a path that has never been walked before, never been explored before, never been attempted before, a third option. And I love that. I absolutely love that. And realizing that this was actually the case, I realized this, I think, maybe a few minutes after after the credits had finished rolling, actually. But realizing this made me feel even happier that I had made the choice that I had made. Because, yeah, I don't want to continue the cycle because that's not the solution, but I also don't want to usher in an Age of Dark because that really does not seem like it would be a good thing. It really does not seem like it would actually be a good thing. So instead, I want to find a third option, which is neither continuing the cycle nor ushering an Age of Dark. And that was just absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. And the music of that final cutscene could not have reflected this choice better than it did. It couldn't have. It's just so beautiful. It's only 1 minute and 17 seconds long, as I found out afterwards, because of course I did end up re-listening to that particular soundtrack several times after that because it was just so good. It's only 1 minute and 17 seconds long, but they are an amazing 1 minute and 17 seconds. I think it was titled Nowhere. I'd have to look it up again, but I think it was titled Nowhere. So just all of that was just an absolutely beautiful conclusion to the entire story. I'm not sure that the answer to the questions asked, what's the meaning of life, what does it mean to be human, were actually answered. Well, a concrete answer wasn't given, but I feel that through the process of the gameplay, through the overcoming of various trials and tribulations, an answer or a possible answer was attempted to be presented in the game. And I feel that Dark Souls 2 is very human. It's very human. I didn't get that sense in Dark Souls 1. Obviously, I did miss several things in my first playthrough of Dark Souls 1, but I didn't get that sense from my first playthrough of Dark Souls 1. Whereas here, at the end of it, I very much was left with the impression that Dark Souls 2 was a very human game. Okay, that sounds terrible actually, now that I say it out loud, it actually sounds terrible, but not quite right. I did say I would try my best to find a way to put all of these things, all of these feelings and thoughts into words. Words are inadequate vessels, really. They are. Unfortunately, the only ones we have to communicate. But it's a very human... I want to say human-centric game, or maybe humanity-centric game, which I feel that Dark Souls 1 wasn't. And honestly, this makes me love Dark Souls 2 even more. It makes me love the game even more. So, yeah, just all of these things were just absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. Made my playthrough very unforgettable. I mean, not just those actually. I almost forgot to mention one of the main reasons why I enjoyed the playthrough so much. Oh, I can't believe I nearly did that. The boss fights, of course. Obviously, the boss fights. Now, the best boss fights, par for the core when it comes to FromSoft, were in the DLC. The best boss fights in Bloodborne were in the DLC. The best boss fights in Dark Souls Remastered were in the DLC. And I can confirm, or at least in my opinion, the best boss fights of Dark Souls 2 were also in the 3 DLCs. So for example, I already mentioned that I massively enjoyed the boss fight against the Fume Knight, but I actually also really enjoyed the boss fight against Sir Alon. I know, I kept complaining about that one move. I know. I'm very aware of that. But once I did actually figure out how to deal with that one particular move, Sir Alon's boss fight was actually really fun, really exciting, and the boss music added to it. It elevated the boss fight into something even more amazing, because through Sir Alon's boss music, I very much got the impression that this boss fight was really a fight where his very honor was at stake. And for a samurai, his honor is everything. So this was essentially a life or death fight for him, but in an honorable way. But at the same time, a very high stakes fight, and this came through brilliantly in the boss music. Or for example, the boss fight against the Burnt Ivory King. There was something very... like, there is a sense of nobility in his boss music, and yet at the same time there is a note of sadness, but it's not sadness caused by grief, but more like sadness, the sadness of his self-sacrifice in a sense, the sacrifice that he made in the name, for the sake of his people and for the sake of his love for Alsana. And that came through so beautifully in his boss music that it made the boss fight even more moving than just knowing his lore would have made it. And honestly, I can say the same for a lot of the other boss fights. Like for example, in the main game, the boss fight against the old Dragon Slayer, there was something so heroic in the old Dragon Slayer's music, but at the same time, it wasn't heroism at its peak. It's more a sense of heroism of a bygone age, something noble and great, but past, not current. And for example, Nashandra's boss music as well was very, very reflective of her story, I feel, because Nashandra's boss music starts very, I can't say innocent, that's very much not the right word. it starts off very unassuming, and then suddenly it turns into this very dangerous kind of music, very dramatic, very dangerous, very threatening. And I feel this reflected her story very well, because initially Nashandra had come to Vendrick as, this person of no great significance. And then only after she had put down some roots, so to say, the truth of her nature, which is a very dangerous nature, came to light. And at that point, it had become a threat that could not simply be removed. It had become something inevitable almost. And this comes through very beautifully in her boss music, or Aldia's boss music. Okay, so first off, I have to say, after all of the conversations with Aldia, I never thought he would actually have boss music. So that really took me by surprise in the final episode. But much like the others, his boss music reflects him beautifully. So Aldia used to be human, a terrible human, granted, but human, and there is this sense of humanity, of humanity in his boss music, but at the same time now he is no longer human, he is an immortal being, an otherworldly being. But he's not otherworldly in the sense that he has become a deity of some sort, which has overwhelming power or something similar. He's just otherworldly being that stays at a distance and observes, and simply allows curiosity to dictate their action or inaction, as the case may be. Because as much as I want to say that he is merely an observer of history at this point of his existence, for lack of a better word, he does actually speak to the bearer of the curse, and words do have power, so tiny little bit of interference there, not just like, how is this experiment going to go from a distance, but rather, I'm going to nudge it a little bit in one direction. And honestly, even this curiosity and this distant otherworldliness, with humanity at its core, came through very beautifully in his music. And again, I have to mention the music at the end of the cutscene after I made my choice. Also just absolutely beautiful. So honestly, the boss fights in this game and the boss music, all of it is just fantastic. And all in all, just overall, Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin is an amazing game that I absolutely believe should be given a chance by more people. Like, I've mentioned it before, and I'm probably going to keep saying it, but, I can't understand why Dark Souls 2 has such a bad reputation. I mean, yes, the initial Dark Souls 2 only had the one option to sit the throne, and it was a bit of a patchwork creature, and this patchwork creature was attempted to be corrected somewhat, made to look like less of a patchwork through the DLCs, with some level of success. But I feel that the addition of Aldia and the story of the First Sin is what truly filled in those holes and made the entire game something not just coherent, but complete and full, and something that has great depth and impact and leaves a lasting impression. So I really do feel, again, that to anyone watching this video, do go ahead and give Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin a fair chance. Start the game with an open mind. Take care of adaptability right at the very beginning, like get that agility up to 98, and afterwards it's going to be an absolutely normal gameplay, where you just be able to enjoy everything. Give the game a chance. Give the game a chance. Give the game a chance, because it's an absolutely amazing game, and personally I am going to keep returning to it. Not just because I want to do NG Plus and to platinum it. And I am very much looking forward to doing NG Plus because there's supposed to be new items, new spells, new soul descriptions, which I'm looking forward to the most almost, new weapons. All of these things await me in NG Plus, and I'm just really looking forward to that. But even once I platinum the game, I'm still going to keep returning to it simply because it's just that amazing. So yeah, all in all, I've got a very positive opinion of Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin, and I'm infinitely glad that I decided to go through the Dark Souls games in chronological order and chose to not to listen to the general opinion that Dark Souls 2 is a bad game and deserves to be skipped, and that the only good Dark Souls games are Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, and really just Dark Souls 3. No. Dark Souls 1 was great, Dark Souls 2 was even better. Like, all of the expectations I had after playing Dark Souls 1 were not just met, they were exceeded by Dark Souls 2. And yeah, it's just an amazing game. So give it a chance, guys. Give it a chance. It deserves it. It deserves it. And, you know, some love is long overdue there. Definitely. Now, specifically for the channel, I did say that I'm going to play all of the Dark Souls games. So since I've finished with Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, I am very much looking forward now to the third and final installment in the trilogy. So I guess that's up next on the channel. I still don't know how to finish these videos. It's terrible. After so much time, I still don't know quite how to finish them. Oh, no, before I finish this video, actually, leave your thoughts about the game in the comments below. Tell me what you thought about it, what your experience with it was, what were your favorite moments, your most frustrating ones, what did you like about it or dislike about it, and just what was your experience with Dark Souls 2? Tell me in the comments below, and I guess give this video a like and subscribe, and see you guys in Dark Souls 3, the complete edition, DLCs included, and yeah, see you there, guys!